The morning air bit at Batbuyer's cheeks as he pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his shoulders. 62 years of life on the Mongolian steppe had taught him to read the sky like a book. Today's pale blue expanse, streaked with thin white clouds, promised a fair day. Good news for a man with a missing goat. Foolish animal, he muttered, scanning the rolling grasslands that stretched to the distant mountains. His breath formed small clouds that vanished quickly in the autumn chill. Batbuyer had risen before dawn, counting his small herd as he did every morning, only to find one young goat missing. Not just any goat, the stubborn black one with the crooked horn that his granddaughter had named Little Star because of the white patch on its forehead. The child would be heartbroken if he returned without it. His weathered hand reached for his walking stick as he followed fresh hoofprints in the soft earth. Recent rains had left the ground muddy in places, making tracking easier than usual. The prince led away from his family's small collection of gers, the round, felt-covered dwellings that had sheltered nomadic herders for thousands of years. Batbuyer's family had herded animals in this region for as long as stories had been told around evening fires. His grandfather had taught his father, who had taught him, the ancient paths where the grass grew sweetest and the locations of hidden springs that never ran dry, even in the harshest summers. When you know the land, his father had told him, you are never truly poor. These words echoed in his mind as he followed the tracks over a small rise. The hoofprints led toward a cluster of rocks. Batbuyer knew well, a landmark he used to guide his herd home when the weather turned. But something looked different today. He squinted, his eyes still sharp despite his years. Yes, there was definitely something unusual about the rock formation. As he drew closer, he realized what had changed. A section of ground near the largest rock had collapsed, creating a dark opening about the size of a small cooking pot. Recent rains must have weakened the earth above what appeared to be some kind of underground space. Little Star? He called, wondering if his goat had fallen in. No bleeding answered his call. Batbuyer knelt carefully beside the hole, his knees protesting the movement. Using his walking stick, he poked at the edges of the opening, causing more soil to crumble away. The hole was now large enough for him to peer inside. Darkness greeted him. He reached into his pocket for the small flashlight he carried for pre-dawn checks on his animals. The weak beam revealed what looked like a man-made chamber below. What is this? He whispered to himself. No ordinary animal den, that was certain. Common sense told him to mark the spot and return with help from the village. But curiosity, the same stubborn curiosity that his wife often scolded him for, pushed him to learn more. Batbuyer carefully lowered himself until his legs dangled into the opening. The drop didn't seem too far. Gripping his flashlight between his teeth, he eased himself down. His feet touched ground sooner than expected. Standing up, he found himself in a space tall enough that he didn't need to stoop. He removed the flashlight from his mouth and swept its beam around the chamber. The sight before him stopped his breath. This was no natural cave. Smooth walls surrounded him, covered in ancient Mongolian script that had somehow survived the centuries. But it was what filled the chamber that made his heart pound against his ribs. Gold. Silver. Weapons with jeweled handles. Silk garments somehow preserved despite the passage of time. Carved wooden furniture inlaid with precious materials. And at the center, resting on a raised platform of stone, a massive sarcophagus decorated with scenes of battle and conquest. Batbuyer had never finished school, but every Mongolian child knew the stories of their greatest leader, the man who had united the warring tribes and built the largest land empire in history. The man whose final resting place had remained a mystery for over 800 years. It cannot be, Batbuyer whispered, his voice sounding strange in the ancient silence. He moved closer to the sarcophagus, his flashlight revealing more details. Golden horses galloped across its surface. Warriors rode with bows drawn. And at the head, a face carved with such skill it seemed alive, wearing the distinctive hat of a great Khan. Batbuyer's hand trembled as he touched the cold metal surface. Thousands had searched for this place over the centuries. Researchers, historians, treasure hunters, all had failed. And now a simple goat herder had stumbled upon what might be the most important archaeological discovery in Mongolian history. His mind raced. What should he do? The old stories warned against disturbing the dead, especially someone as powerful as the Great Khan. His grandmother would have said that such actions invited spirits to follow you home. Yet this was a find of tremendous importance for his country, perhaps even the world. A noise from above startled him, the distinct sound of a goat's hoof on stone. Batbire looked up to see Little Star peering down at him through the opening, her crooked horn silhouetted against the sky. "So there you are, troublemaker," he said, his voice unsteady from what he'd discovered. "You led me here on purpose, didn't you?" The goat bleated as if in answer, then disappeared from view. Batbire knew he needed to leave. His family would be wondering where he was, and he needed to think about what to do next. He looked around one last time, trying to burn every detail into his memory. Who would believe him without proof? He considered taking something small, just as evidence, but something stopped his hand. If this truly was the tomb of Genghis Khan, it had remained undisturbed for centuries. Who was he to be the first to take from it? Instead, he pulled out his simple phone, a gift from his son who worked in the city, and took several photos, though the flashlight barely provided enough light. Then, with great effort, he climbed back through the opening, pulling himself up with the help of exposed roots. Once outside, he found Little Star calmly grazing nearby as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Batbire gathered the goat into his arms, surprising the animal with his unusual display of affection. "You've caused quite enough trouble for one day," he told the goat, "but perhaps you've also made me the luckiest herder in all Mongolia." As he walked back toward his family's camp, Batbire's mind swirled with questions. Should he tell the local officials? His family first? What would happen to this peaceful valley once word got out? Would the government take the land his family had used for generations? The weight of his discovery pressed on him with each step. He had found something lost to time, something many believed was hidden on purpose, with all who knew the location killed to keep the secret. The old stories claimed Genghis Khan had asked to be buried without marking, returned to the earth as simply as he had entered it, despite his world-changing life. By the time his family's gers came into view, smoke rising gently from the central chimney, Batbire had made his decision. He would tell his oldest son first, the one who had studied history in school before returning to the herder's life. Together, they would figure out the right thing to do. Little Star squirmed in his arms, eager to rejoin the herd. Batbire set the goat down, watching as it trotted toward the other animals as if this were any ordinary day. "Nothing will be ordinary after this," he said softly to himself, patting the phone in his pocket that held proof of his incredible find. He had no way of knowing then how true those words would prove to be, or how his simple life was about to change forever. Nor could he have predicted how his chance discovery would shake the foundations of history and awaken forces both modern and ancient, forces beyond his wildest imagination. Batbire sat at the low wooden table in his son's gear, staring at the small screen of his phone as his son Tushig swiped through the photos. Outside, the evening wind whistled across the steppe, a familiar sound that had always brought comfort. Tonight it seemed to carry whispers of change. "Father, are you certain about what you saw?" Tushig asked, his university education making him cautious where others might have leapt to conclusions. "I know what I saw," Batbire replied, tapping the phone. "Look at the carvings, the script. You studied these things. Tell me what else it could be." Tushig zoomed in on a particular image showing the detailed carvings on the sarcophagus. His eyes widened slightly. "These symbols, they're consistent with 13th century Mongolian script. And this headdress." He fell silent, the implications sinking in. Batbire's wife, Altansetsig, poured more milk tea into their bowls. "Whatever it is, it has been there for centuries. It can wait one more night. Let's think carefully before doing anything." But word spread faster than even the most cautious family could control. By morning, Batbire's brother-in-law had heard the story. By noon, the village elder had asked to see the photos. By evening, someone had called their cousin who worked for a local newspaper in the provincial capital. 3 days later, a dusty jeep arrived carrying 2 men from the regional heritage office. They asked Batbire to lead them to the site. Standing at the opening, which had grown larger due to natural erosion, the younger official turned pale when his flashlight revealed what lay below. "We need to call Ulaanbaatar immediately," he said, his voice tight with excitement. Within a week, the peaceful valley transformed. Government trucks rumbled across the once quiet grassland. Tents sprang up like mushrooms after rain, Batbuyer watched from a distance as men in uniform strung bright yellow tape around the site, while others carefully widened the opening into a proper entrance. "They're asking for you," Tushig said, approaching his father who stood watching the activity from the hillside where he usually grazed his goats. "The professor from the National University wants to speak with you." Batbuyer reluctantly made his way down to the growing camp. A thin man with glasses and a city dweller's pale complexion extended his hand. "Mr. Batbuyer, I'm Professor Ganbold. What you've discovered?" He seemed to search for words. "It may be the most significant archaeological find in our nation's history." The professor led him to a large tent filled with computer equipment. "We've only begun preliminary examination, but the artifacts date to the correct period. The location matches what little historical record we have about where the Great Khan might have been laid to rest. And most importantly," he lowered his voice as if sharing a secret, "we've found human remains." Batbuyer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "DNA testing will take time. But if this truly is Genghis Khan..." The professor removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Well, you understand the importance. Everyone understood the importance." By the end of the week, the story had exploded beyond their small corner of Mongolia. Batbuyer first realized how big things had become when a helicopter landed near their summer camp. Out stepped people with cameras and microphones and rapid-fire questions. His granddaughter hid behind his legs as strangers thrust recording devices toward his face. "How did you feel when you realized what you'd found? Has the government offered you a reward? Will you move to the city now? Did you take anything from the tomb?" That last question came from a sharp-faced woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes. Batbuyer frowned at her. "I took nothing," he said firmly. "It wasn't mine to take." The reporter's interest faded briefly when government officials blocked further access to the site. But then international news agencies arrived. Batbuyer received offers of money for exclusive interviews, sums larger than what his family earned in 5 years of herding. "You should accept," urged his cousin Bolorma when she visited from the provincial capital. "This is your chance to give your grandchildren a better life." But Tushig disagreed. "Father discovered something that belongs to all Mongolians, to history itself. We shouldn't profit from it." The debate became moot when government officials asked the family to temporarily relocate for their own privacy. They were given a comfortable apartment in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city. For the first time in his life, Batbuyer slept in a building that didn't move with the wind. He hated it. 2 weeks after the discovery, Batbuyer sat uncomfortably in a government office as an official, explained that the site had been designated a national treasure of highest significance. Security had been increased after rumors of potential tomb robbers circulated. "We've brought in experts from around the world," the official said. "The preservation work alone will take months. Years, possibly." Batbuyer nodded, thinking of his goats now being tended by his nephew, of the autumn migration they would miss, of the rhythms of life disrupted. "There's something else," the official continued, sliding a document across the desk. "Preliminary DNA results." Batbuyer looked at the paper covered in scientific terms he couldn't understand. The remains showed genetic markers consistent with the Great Khan's known lineage, the official explained. "We can't be certain yet, but the implications hung in the air. If confirmed, this wasn't just an important archaeological find. It was the discovery of the millennium." That evening, as Batbuyer looked out the apartment window at the city lights so different from his beloved stars, his phone rang. It was Professor Ganbold, his voice unusually strained. "Mr. Batbuyer, has anyone from the site contacted you?" "No, what's wrong?" "There's been an incident. The lead archaeologist collapsed this morning. No apparent cause. Is he ill? The doctors can't explain it, and there's more. The equipment keeps malfunctioning near the tomb. Specialized cameras, dating tools, all failing." Batbuyer thought of his grandmother's stories about disturbing the dead. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "some things are meant to stay buried." The professor was quiet for a moment. "Science doesn't recognize curses, Mr. Batbuyer. Neither does the wind, yet it still blows." The next day brought more reporters and more questions. International delegations began arriving in Mongolia. The Chinese government expressed historical interest in the find. Russian archaeologists requested access. A delegation from Kazakhstan claimed cultural heritage rights. Batbuyer watched it all from his city exile, feeling more distant from his discovery with each passing day. The simple act of finding the tomb had set in motion events beyond his control, ripples expanding into waves. Then came the phone call that changed everything again. Father. Tushig's voice sounded strange, tight with worry. It's Kulan. Buttbuyer's heart clenched at the mention of his granddaughter's name. What's happened? She's sick. The doctors don't know what's wrong. She was fine yesterday, but this morning she couldn't get out of bed. Her fever is very high. Batbuyer thought of the archaeologist who had fallen ill, of the malfunctioning equipment. Has she said anything? He asked. Only that she keeps seeing a man on horseback in her dreams. A warrior, she says, who tells her we've taken something that isn't ours. The old herder closed his eyes, his free hand gripping the windowsill. I'm coming home, he said. But the officials said, I don't care what they said. My place is with my family. That night, ignoring all government requests, Batbuyer took a bus back to the province where his family waited. As the vehicle rumbled through the darkness, he gazed out at the passing landscape, thinking of what he'd unleashed. He'd spent his life reading the land, the sky, the behavior of animals, finding meaning in patterns most people never noticed. Now he sensed a different pattern forming, one as old as the steppe itself. The living had disturbed the dead, and the dead, it seemed, had noticed. When the bus dropped him at the provincial center just before dawn, Tushig was waiting with their old truck. They drove in silence toward the summer camp, now largely abandoned as most locals had either left to avoid the commotion or found temporary work with the research teams. How is she? Batbuyer finally asked as they bumped along the dirt track. No change. The fever remains. The city doctor says we should take her to a hospital, but... Tushig's hands tightened on the steering wheel. But they both knew hospitals meant money they didn't have, despite all the offers for Batbuyer's story. As the rising sun painted the steppe gold, Batbuyer made his decision. When they reached camp, he would go see his granddaughter. Then he would visit the tomb once more. Some conversations needed to happen face to face, even if one of the participants had been dead for 800 years. Kulan's small body burned with fever. Batbuyer placed a cool cloth on his granddaughter's forehead, his weathered hands gentle against her flushed skin. Outside the family ger, the wind had picked up, whistling with unusual force for this time of year. She's been like this for 3 days, whispered Altansetseg, worry etching deep lines around her eyes. The medicine from the doctor does nothing. Batbuyer nodded, watching the 8-year-old's restless sleep. Occasionally, she would mumble words he couldn't quite catch, her small hands grasping at the air as if reaching for something. Or someone. Has she said anything else about the dreams? He asked. His son Tushig sat in the corner, his university textbooks forgotten beside him. She keeps talking about a warrior on a white horse. Says he's angry. Says we've taken something. Batbuyer's stomach tightened. He hadn't told his family about Professor Ganbold's call regarding the archaeologist's mysterious illness, or about the equipment failures, or the strange storms that had appeared suddenly over the dig site, dissipating just as quickly. I need to go back to the tomb, Batbuyer said finally. Altansetseg grabbed his arm. Why, what good will that do? I'm not sure, but I found it. Maybe I'm meant to. He trailed off, unsure how to express the feeling pulling at him. His wife studied his face, then nodded slowly. After 40 years together, she knew when his mind was set. Be careful, was all she said. Getting to the site proved more difficult than expected. The government had established checkpoints on all approaching roads. Military vehicles stood guard. Journalists camped nearby, hoping for updates or glimpses of activity. Batbuyer approached on foot, using the knowledge of the land that had served him all his life. He took rarely used goat paths through rocky outcroppings, becoming just another shadow in the gathering dusk. The site itself had transformed. Floodlights illuminated a large tent constructed over the entrance. Generators hummed. Scientists in white protective suits moved between temporary structures housing laboratories and storage. Batbuyer watched from a ridge, wondering how to get closer without being seen. As if answering his unspoken question, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. Voices raised in confusion. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Batbuyer heard someone mention backup generators failing too. He took his chance, moving quickly down the slope, keeping to the shadows. The chaos of the power failure provided perfect cover, as he slipped past distracted guards and made his way to the entrance of the tomb. The temporary staircase they'd built into the opening was empty. Taking a deep breath, Batbuyer descended, the small flashlight from his pocket guiding his way. The chamber had changed. Bright lights on stands now stood dark due to the power failure. Tables held labeled artifacts. Computers and equipment lined one wall. The sarcophagus remained at the center, but now stood partially open. Batbuyer approached it slowly, his heart pounding. They had opened it. After 8 centuries, the Great Khan's rest had been disturbed. "You shouldn't be here." The voice made Batbuyer spin around. Professor Ganbold stood at the bottom of the stairs, his own flashlight pointed at the floor. "My granddaughter is sick," Batbuyer said simply. The professor's expression changed. "Like Otgon Bayar, our lead archaeologist." "Yes, and I think we both know why." The professor sighed, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. "Science doesn't recognize curses. You said that before." Batbuyer gestured around the chamber. "But science can't explain why 3 separate generators failed at once, or why healthy people suddenly fall ill, or why every piece of dating equipment gives different results for the same artifacts." Ganbold was quiet for a long moment. "There have been other incidents. Things I haven't reported officially. Tell me, dreams. Everyone working closely with the remains reports the same dream. A mounted warrior warning them. And there's more." The professor hesitated. "The tissue samples we took for DNA testing? They changed overnight, as if they were decomposing at an impossible rate. And the photos? Digital images of the remains blur inexplicably." Batbuyer wasn't surprised. "My grandmother used to say that the powerful carry their power even into death." And who was more powerful than the Great Khan? A sudden gust of wind swept through the chamber, impossible as they were underground with only one entrance. Yet both men felt it, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of distant grasslands and horses. "What do we do?" the professor asked, his scientific certainty shaken. "We listen," Batbuyer said. "When a storm comes on the steppe, the wise herder doesn't fight it. He respects its power." Moving to the sarcophagus, Batbuyer placed his hand on its edge. "Great Khan," he said in Mongolian, his voice steady despite his fear. "I am Batbuyer, a simple herder who found your rest. My granddaughter suffers. Tell me how to make this right." The air in the chamber grew heavy, pressing against their ears. The temperature dropped. Batbuyer's flashlight flickered but held. "There," Professor Ganbold whispered, pointing. On the wall opposite them, shadows moved, though nothing was there to cast them. They took shape. Riders on horseback, a great army in silhouette. "The Khan's warriors," Batbuyer breathed. The shadow army circled the walls of the chamber, growing more distinct. At their head rode a figure larger than the rest, his posture regal even in shadow. Batbuyer bowed his head in respect. "Great Khan, we have disturbed your rest. Tell us how to make amends." For a long moment nothing happened. Then Batbuyer's flashlight died. In the complete darkness he felt rather than saw movement. A hand, impossibly cold, touched his shoulder. Words filled his mind, not spoken but somehow understood. When light returned moments later as the professor shook his flashlight back to life, Batbuyer stood alone, his face ashen. "What happened?" Ganbold asked, his voice tight with fear. "You vanished in the darkness." "I know what we must do," Batbuyer said quietly. The next morning, as sunrise painted the steppe gold, government officials found themselves facing an unlikely alliance, a simple herder and a distinguished professor standing side by side. The excavation must stop. Professor Ganbold announced to the assembled officials and international representatives. All testing must cease. The remains must be returned exactly as they were found. Protests erupted immediately. This is an unprecedented historical discovery. The scientific value alone, the cultural significance, the tourism potential. Batbuyer stepped forward, silencing the room with his quiet dignity. "My granddaughter is not the only one who has fallen ill. Strange things happen around this site. The Great Khan's wish was to rest undisturbed. We have ignored that wish, and now we face the consequences." The Minister of Culture scoffed. "You expect us to believe in some ancient curse? In the 21st century? I expect you to respect our history," Batbuyer replied. "The Khan united warring tribes into the greatest land empire ever known. His leadership shaped half the world. And yes, I expect you to consider that there are forces we don't understand. Forces that have protected this tomb for 8 centuries until now. Professor Ganbold cleared his throat. As chief scientist on this project, I formally recommend ceasing all invasive testing. My full report will detail the unexplainable incidents we've documented. The debate raged for hours. International delegates argued for continued research. Government officials worried about lost prestige and revenue. Scientists were divided between curiosity and growing unease. As the sun began to set, Batbuyer received a phone call that changed everything. "The fever is broken," Tushig said, relief clear in his voice. "Kulan is asking for soup. The doctor can't explain it." That same evening, news arrived that the lead archaeologist Utgon Bayar had also recovered suddenly. And the strange storms that had plagued the site for weeks had cleared, leaving perfect weather. Word spread quickly among the workers. Many Mongolians, regardless of their education, still respected the old beliefs. Several refused to continue working at the site. Even some foreign scientists admitted to experiencing the strange dreams of a warning rider. 3 days after Batbayar's night visit to the tomb, the Minister of Culture called a press conference. Looking uncomfortable, he announced a temporary halt to invasive research at the site pending further cultural considerations. Privately, he told Batbayar, "This isn't over. Too many powerful interests are involved now. China is claiming historical territorial rights to the site. Russia is demanding access for their scientists. The international archaeology community is outraged at the suspension." Batbuyer listened, then said simply, "The Khan was patient for 800 years. He can be patient a while longer." That night, Batbayar sat with his recovered granddaughter, listening to her chatter about wanting to return to the summer pastures, about missing her goats, about ordinary child concerns. The shadow of illness had passed from her face. "Grandfather," she said suddenly, her small hand touching his weathered one. "The horseman says thank you." Batbuyer felt a chill run down his spine. "What horseman, little one?" "The one who was angry but isn't anymore. He says you kept your promise." She yawned, already drifting toward sleep. "He says a storm is coming, but not from the sky." Outside, under the vast starry sky of the Mongolian steppe, Batbuyer considered her words. The Khan's warning echoed in his mind. The battle over the tomb had only just begun. A month after the government announced the temporary halt to research at the tomb, Batbuyer stood outside his family's gur, watching military helicopters circle in the distance. Though he had returned to the seasonal rhythms of herding, the world beyond their pastures had not returned to normal. "Another delegation arrived this morning," said Tushig, joining his father. "Chinese officials this time. Their motorcade passed through the village on the way to the provincial capital." Batbuyer nodded, his eyes still on the distant helicopters. "And those?" he asked, pointing skyward. "Border patrol, they say, but everyone knows they're watching the tomb." The temporary halt to research hadn't meant a decrease in interest. If anything, international attention had intensified. What had begun as a scientific discovery had quickly evolved into a diplomatic nightmare. The Chinese television said the tomb site sits on land that was part of ancient Chinese territory, Tushig continued. "They're claiming rights to participate in any research," Batbuyer snorted. "And I suppose Russia claims it was part of their empire too?" "Actually, yes. Their ambassador made a statement yesterday." Tushig shook his head. "Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan have all filed formal requests with our government as well, claiming cultural heritage rights since the Khan's empire included their lands. The Khan belonged to no one but Mongolia," Batbuyer said firmly, "and in the end, he belonged only to the eternal blue sky." Later that afternoon, Professor Ganbold's dusty jeep appeared on the horizon. Since their unlikely alliance at the tomb, the professor had become a regular visitor, bringing news from the capital and updates about the diplomatic situation. "It's getting worse," Ganbold said without preamble, accepting a bowl of milk tea from Altan Setseg. "International press is calling it the Great Khan Crisis now." He pulled out a tablet computer and showed them news footage from around the world. Protesters in Beijing waved signs demanding Chinese access to the research. In Moscow, scholars gave impassioned speeches about historical connections between Russian and Mongolian peoples. Social media buzzed with conspiracy theories and nationalistic claims. "Our government is caught in the middle," the professor continued. "Tourism companies are already selling packages. Visit the Great Khan's tomb, even though the site remains closed to the public. The economic pressure to reopen the research is enormous. And the artifacts? Batbayar asked. The ones already removed before we stopped the work? Ganbold's expression darkened. That's why I came in person. There was a break-in at the National Museum last night. Several items from the tomb were stolen. Kulan, who had been playing quietly nearby, suddenly looked up. The horseman will be angry again, she said matter-of-factly. The adults fell silent, remembering the mysterious illnesses that had only abated when they promised to respect the tomb. There's more, Ganbold said quietly. The night guard at the museum fell into a coma during the theft. No physical injuries, no explanation, just like before. That night, as his family slept, Batbayar sat outside watching the stars. The vast steppe stretched in all directions, unchanged for centuries despite the empires that had risen and fallen across it. His ancestors had ridden with the great Khan, ordinary herders who became warriors when called to serve. A soft noise made him turn. Kulan stood in the Jir's doorway, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light inside. You should be sleeping, little one, Batbayar said gently. The horseman is in my dreams again, she replied, coming to sit beside him. He says the stolen things must be returned. Batbayar put his arm around his granddaughter. Did he say anything else? She nodded solemnly. He says blood will be spilled if they are not returned. He says the old borders will become new again. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down Batbayar's spine. The old borders could only mean the boundaries of the vast Mongol Empire, which had stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe at its height. Those borders now encompassed dozens of modern nations. The next morning brought news that confirmed his worst fears. Satellite imagery showed Chinese military units moving closer to the Mongolian border. Russia had announced training exercises near their shared frontier. Both nations claimed the movements were routine, but the timing was impossible to ignore. They wouldn't actually fight over a tomb, would they? Tushig asked as the family gathered around their small radio. Nations have fought over less, Batbayar replied. And this is not just any tomb. 3 days later, international news reported a confrontation between Mongolian border guards and what Chinese officials called archaeological security personnel, who had crossed into Mongolian territory near the tomb site. No shots were fired, but soldiers on both sides had drawn weapons. The United Nations Security Council called an emergency session. Mongolia, with its small military and economy dependent on its powerful neighbors, found itself at the center of global attention. The Secretary General has personally requested to speak with you, Professor Ganbold told Batbayar over a crackling phone connection. As the discoverer, your voice carries weight. What would I say to such important people? Batbayar asked. I'm just a herder. You're the one person who has no political agenda in this, Ganbold replied. Perhaps the only one. Reluctantly, Batbayar agreed to travel to Ulaanbaatar. The capital was unrecognizable from his visit just weeks earlier. International media crowded the streets. Protesters from various countries waved signs and chanted slogans. Military vehicles patrolled major intersections. At the government building, officials hurried Batbayar through back entrances to avoid the press. In a conference room equipped with video screens, he found himself facing the projected image of the UN Secretary General and representatives from a dozen countries. Mr. Batbayar, the Secretary General began, thank you for joining us during this sensitive time. As the discoverer of the tomb, your perspective is valuable to all parties. Batbayar, wearing his best del, the traditional Mongolian overcoat, felt out of place among the suits and uniforms. But he straightened his shoulders, remembering that his ancestors had stood before khans and emperors. I am a simple man who follows his animals across the same land my forefathers tended, he began. I found the tomb by accident, but perhaps it was not accident at all, but fate. He described the discovery, the mysterious illnesses, and the apparent supernatural warnings. In another setting, such talk might have been dismissed, but the unexplained events around the tomb had been too numerous, too consistent to ignore completely. The great Khan united warring tribes into one nation, Batbayar continued. He did not desire a marked grave or monument. History says he asked to be buried secretly, returning to the earth as simply as he entered it. The Chinese representative interrupted. With all respect, the historical artifacts belong to all humanity. Their scientific and cultural value, Their cultural value lies in respecting the wishes of the one who created that culture. Batbayar replied firmly. Would you dig up your own ancestors against their final wishes? As the debate continued, an aide entered and whispered urgently to the Mongolian Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's face paled. I've just received word, he announced, interrupting the discussion. Satellite imagery shows additional military movements along both our northern and southern borders. And, he hesitated, reports are coming in that several individuals involved in the museum theft have been found unconscious. The stolen artifacts are missing again. Silence fell over the conference room. On the video screens, representatives exchanged worried glances. The Secretary General cleared his throat. Given these developments, I propose an international peacekeeping presence at the tomb site until a diplomatic solution can be reached. More arguments erupted, with China and Russia both objecting to foreign troops near their borders. Smaller nations worried about being caught between competing powers. Economic interests clashed with historical claims and modern borders. Through it all, Batbayar sat quietly thinking of his granddaughter's words. A storm is coming, but not from the sky. When he finally spoke again, the room fell silent. The tomb has remained hidden for 8 centuries, he said. In all that time, empires have risen and fallen. Borders have been drawn and redrawn. Yet the Khan remained at peace. Now, within weeks of our discovery, nations threaten war. People fall mysteriously ill. The Khan's warnings come in dreams and storms. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. I am not a politician or a scientist. I'm a herder who has spent his life reading the sky and the land. And everything I know tells me we are making a terrible mistake. The stolen artifacts must be returned. The tomb must be resealed. The Khan must be allowed to rest as he wished. That evening, as Batbayar prepared to return to his family, Professor Ganbold brought him a newspaper. The headline read, Global tensions rise as tomb crisis deepens. It's out of your hands now, Ganbold said sadly. Out of all our hands, Batbayar shook his head. Nothing is ever truly out of our hands. Even the great Khan understood that a leader must sometimes bow to forces greater than himself. As his plane took off, Batbayar looked down at the sprawling capital, then out toward the distant steppe where the tomb lay. Dark storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, though the weather report had predicted clear skies. He thought again of his granddaughter, his words, and wondered what the Khan's next message would be and whether the modern world would listen before it was too late. Storm clouds darkened. The sky as Batbayar's plane touched down at the small provincial airport. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. His son Tushig waited by an old truck, his face tight with worry. You've seen the news? Tushig asked as they drove toward home. Batbayar nodded. In the 3 days since the UN meeting, the situation had worsened. Chinese and Russian diplomats had walked out of emergency talks. Both countries had moved additional troops to their borders with Mongolia. International news spoke of the tomb crisis in the same breath as other global flashpoints. And at home? Batbayar asked. More people have fallen ill, not just those connected to the tomb research or the stolen artifacts. Ordinary people who simply touched photos of the artifacts or shared news stories about them online. Tushig gripped the steering wheel tighter. People are scared, Father. They're saying it's the Khan's curse spreading. As they crested a hill, Batbayar saw military vehicles on the road ahead. Not the usual border patrol, but heavy equipment. Soldiers directed traffic around a convoy of trucks. UN peacekeepers, Tushig explained. They're setting up a neutral protection zone around the tomb. The government agreed after satellite images showed both Chinese and Russian special forces moving toward the area. Back at the family's GER, Kulan ran to embrace her grandfather. The child seemed thinner than when he'd left, dark circles under her eyes. The dreams won't stop, grandfather, she whispered. The horseman is very angry now. That night, as the family slept, Batbayar was awakened by a sound he knew well. Hoofbeats on the steppe. But these were not the soft steps of his own horses. These were the thundering approach of many riders. He stepped outside. The night was clear, stars brilliant above, though he'd fallen asleep to the rumble of distant thunder. The sound of hooves grew louder, yet he saw no horses, no riders, just the empty steppe silvered by moonlight. A cold wind rose suddenly, carrying whispers in an ancient form of Mongolian. The shadows around the Jur deepened, shifted, took shape. Batbayar found himself surrounded by the silhouettes of mounted warriors, their forms translucent in the moonlight. At their head rode a figure taller than the rest, his bearing regal even in shadow. The great Khan himself returned from 8 centuries of rest. Batbuyer dropped to one knee, bowing his head in respect. "Great Khan," he said, "I hear your warnings. I have tried to make them listen." The spectral army circled him, their forms growing more solid with each pass. The temperature dropped until Batbuyer's breath clouded before him. The Khan's shadow mount stopped before him. Though the figure spoke no words, meaning filled Batbuyer's mind. The tomb must be resealed. All that was taken must be returned. Blood must not be spilled over bones already 8 centuries in the ground. "I've told them this," Batbuyer replied. "But nations do not listen to simple herders. Then they will listen to the Khan himself." The vision vanished, leaving Batbuyer alone under the stars, shivering not from cold but from certainty about what would come next. Dawn brought news that sent shockwaves around the world. Overnight, every person connected to the tomb research, scientists, officials, museum workers, had experienced the same dream of mounted warriors led by the great Khan himself. More disturbingly, military commanders stationed near the borders reported the same vision. By midday, the international media was in a frenzy. News channels showed interviews with shaken diplomats and soldiers describing identical dreams. Religious leaders called it divine intervention. Scientists struggled for rational explanations. Social media exploded with theories and interpretations. Professor Ganbold arrived at Batbuyer's camp by helicopter, his normally composed face ashen. "It happened to you too?" Batbuyer asked, already knowing the answer. The professor nodded. "Everyone connected to the research. Everyone. And there's more. The stolen artifacts reappeared on the steps of the National Museum this morning. The thieves were found nearby, unconscious but alive, with no memory of what happened." Batbuyer wasn't surprised. "And the military situation?" "That's why I'm here. There's an emergency meeting at the provincial capital. The president himself has requested your presence." 2 hours later, Batbuyer found himself in a room with Mongolia's highest officials, along with representatives from the UN, China, Russia, and a dozen other nations. Everyone looked shaken, dark circles under their eyes suggesting none had slept well after the shared vision. The Mongolian president opened the meeting. "We face an unprecedented situation. Whatever your beliefs about the supernatural, we cannot ignore what has happened. Over 10,000 people across 5 countries experienced the identical dream last night. This goes beyond coincidence or mass hysteria." The Chinese representative spoke next, his usual confidence subdued. "Our government has reconsidered its position on the research rights. In light of recent events, we propose a joint statement respecting the cultural significance of the site." The Russian diplomat nodded in agreement. "Our government shares this view. The tomb should be treated with appropriate historical respect." Batbuyer listened as diplomats who days earlier had been threatening military action now spoke of cooperation and respect. The Khan's message had reached them more effectively than any human could have managed. When asked to speak, Batbuyer kept his words simple. "I am just a herder who follows his animals across the same lands the great Khan once ruled. I found his tomb by accident, but I believe nothing about this has been accidental. The Khan chose this moment in history to be found, and he has made his wishes clear." By sunset, a remarkable document had been drafted and signed by all parties. The Eternal Sky Accord established that all artifacts removed from the tomb would be returned to their original positions. Kautu, the tomb would be resealed and the entrance concealed. A small jeer monument would mark the general area, but the exact location would remain unrecorded. The site would be declared an international heritage zone, protected jointly by all signatory nations but never excavated again. The Khan's desire for an unmarked grave would be respected for all time. 1 month later, on a crisp autumn day, much like the one when he'd first discovered the tomb, Batbuyer stood on a hill overlooking the site. The military vehicles were gone. The scientific equipment had been removed. A simple wooden platform allowed officials and spiritual leaders to witness the final resealing of the entrance. Professor Ganbold joined him on the hillside. "You know, we could have learned so much," he said wistfully. "Advanced our understanding of history of the Khan's era." "Some knowledge comes at too high a price," Batbuyer replied. "And some wishes deserve respect even after 8 centuries." Together they watched as the last of the artifacts was carried into the tomb, the ornate sword that had lain on the sarcophagus. The monks from the nearby monastery began their chants, the ancient words carrying on the wind. Kulan tugged at her grandfather's sleeve. "The horseman is happy now," she said simply. "He says you kept your promise." As the workers began filling in the entrance with soil and rock, returning it to how Batbuyer had first found it, a single white horse appeared on the distant ridge. Everyone at the ceremony saw it, a magnificent stallion standing proudly against the sky, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. For one impossible moment, Batbuyer thought he saw a figure astride it, a man in ancient armor, his face turned toward the eternal blue sky. Then the horse was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. That evening, as international delegations departed and the world's attention began to move on to new crises, Batbuyer sat with his family around their cooking fire. His grandson asked the question that many would ask in years to come. "Grandfather, did you ever wish you hadn't found the tomb?" Batbuyer considered this as he sipped his milk tea. "No," he said finally. "The Khan chose to be found when the world needed a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Tushig asked. "That some things are more important than borders or power or wealth. That respect for the past helps us find our way in the present." Batbuyer looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky, and that sometimes the wisest thing a leader can do, even the greatest leader, is to let go of power and return to the earth. In the years that followed, Batbuyer continued his simple life as a herder. The world gradually moved on, though the tomb incident was studied in diplomatic academies as an example of how ancient wisdom could sometimes resolve modern conflicts. Occasionally, tourists would visit the small monument gear that marked the general vicinity of the tomb. They would take photos and leave small offerings of respect, but none would ever know the exact location where the great Khan rested. And on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind blew from the north, herders on the steppe would sometimes report seeing riders on the horizon, spectral warriors keeping their eternal watch over the hidden tomb of Genghis Khan.